Long before Nancy ever touched the jar, the desert had already chosen her. For generations, stories had drifted through villages along the Nile. They were whispers of 6 clay jars, unearthed across Egypt, each found by chance, each carrying a fragment of something that once belonged to a forgotten dynasty. And every person who discovered one of those jars had vanished without a trace, without explanation. The 7th jar, the final and most dangerous of them all, had never been found. Until now. Nancy was an expert in her field, restoring ancient burial shrouds and a collapsed annex of a minor tomb near Luxor. It was tedious work, but she had a keen eye. That's when she noticed it, a dust pattern on a cracked wall. It wasn't random. The dust formed a perfect ring, a circle broken at one point, like a mouth waiting to speak. Driven by a curiosity she couldn't ignore, she brushed the dust away. With a faint groan, a small stone panel shifted inward. Behind it was pure darkness, and within that darkness, a jar. It was small, elegant, and sealed with blackened resin. 7 serpent-like grooves spiraled down its curved surface. As she reached for it, the air around it felt strangely warm, as if it was breathing. Nancy touched it. The moment her fingers brushed against the cool clay, she felt a sudden pressure. It wasn't pain, but a distinct weight, as if something invisible was pressing against her mind, testing it, probing it. Then, just as quickly, the sensation shifted to one of approval. She withdrew her hand, but the warmth clung to her palm like oil, a phantom touch she couldn't wipe away. That night, she carried the jar back to her temporary housing in Luxor, completely unaware that every single footstep she took echoed in an ancient darkness that had already begun to follow her. Nancy set the jar on her desk, the strange warmth still radiating from it, and went to sleep, exhausted from the day's discovery. The jar, however, did not sleep. At the first hour after midnight, the seal on its mouth cracked, but it didn't break. Instead, a thin, nearly silent exhale of warm air slipped out, like a sigh from someone who had been holding their breath for centuries. The temperature in her small room began to rise, slowly but noticeably. Then came the sand. Grain by grain, it began to collect on the floor beneath the jar, even though her windows and doors were tightly closed against the night. Nancy woke at dawn, drenched in sweat. She sat up, her eyes immediately drawn to the desk. The jar now rested in a perfect, undisturbed circle of fine desert sand. A shiver ran down her spine, cold despite the room's cloying heat. In the next room, something shifted. The sound was too heavy to be a mouse, but far too slow and deliberate to be a person. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was just the old building settling, the kind of noise you expect in a place like this. But the jar watched her. She could feel it, a silent, eyeless gaze that followed her every move. That evening, Nancy decided she couldn't keep this to herself. She wrapped the jar carefully in a linen cloth and walked through Luxor's quiet back streets. Her destination was the university, where a professor she trusted could hopefully shed some light on this unnerving artifact. But with each turn she made, the air grew hotter, more oppressive. The jar, cradled in her hands, began to vibrate faintly, a low thrumming that seemed to work its way up her arms and into her chest. And then she began to hear them. Footsteps behind her, soft, bare, and dragging slightly, as if the walker was exhausted or wounded. Whenever she spun around, her heart pounding, the street was empty. the sound would stop. But as soon as she started walking again, the footsteps returned, always just behind her, always just out of sight. Back home, she placed the wrapped jar on the table and leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. The air in her apartment felt thick, heavy, like she was breathing through water. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched too far, seeming to bend and distort the walls, making the small space feel like a cavern. And then she saw it, a shape standing in the darkest corner. It was tall, impossibly still, and utterly faceless. She blinked once, twice, and it dissolved back into the normal shadows. But the jar vibrated harder now, a clear, insistent pulse. Whatever had been waiting inside for so long was waking up. On the third night, Nancy found a mark on her forearm. It was a thin, faint line, like a brush of ancient ink that had soaked into her skin. It didn't wash off. It didn't fade. The next morning, a second line appeared beside it. By that evening, there was a third. Each line curved around her skin, a perfect imitation of the grooves on the jar. With a breath that tightened in her throat, she realized the terrible truth. The jar wasn't marked with serpents. It was marked with stages. 7 stages. 7 marks, 7 steps for something to return from the void. And Nancy was already on step 3. That night, she dreamed. She was in a throne room filled with shimmering gold dust. A figure sat on a high chair, a regal form wrapped head to toe in linen. Its face was a mask of polished obsidian stone, and carved into it were 7 eyes. As she watched, frozen, all 7 of them turned and fixed their gaze directly on her. She woke up screaming, the sound swallowed by her small room. She looked down, her hand trembling. The 4th mark was already on her neck. Frantically, Nancy began to research. She scoured ancient texts, museum archives, and obscure historical journals. The stories were there, hidden in plain sight. 6 jars found over the last century, scattered across the sands of Egypt. Each belonged to a dynasty that had been deliberately erased from history, a dynasty ruled not by kings, but by Sekhem-bearers, powerful priests who claimed to store pieces of their very souls in clay vessels for safekeeping. The legend said that if all 7 jars were reunited, the complete soul would awaken, reborn in its full, terrifying power. But in every recorded case, there was a crucial missing piece. The final jar, the 7th jar, was always found empty. Until now, Nancy's jar wasn't empty. It was filling, and she was the vessel. The 7th night came swiftly, a shroud of darkness falling over Luxor. Nancy felt the 7th and final mark burn itself onto her skin before she even opened her eyes. Her body felt strangely light, her own memories blurring at the edges, like a faded photograph. Her heartbeat wasn't alone anymore. Something else pulsed just beneath her ribs, a foreign rhythm beating out of sync with her own. She stumbled to the bathroom, her legs unsteady. In the dim reflection of the mirror, she saw it. Something was moving behind her, a tall figure, wrapped in linen, its eyes glowing like molten gold. It lifted its hand, mirroring her own movement. But this was no reflection. This was possession. Her breath vanished from her lungs. Her skin tightened, feeling like old parchment. Her bones felt wrong, as if they were being reshaped from within. Nancy felt herself pulled forward, toward the mirror, into the cold, unforgiving glass. But it wasn't cold. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and the figure stepped through. It touched her shoulder, a gesture that was almost gentle, like a master greeting a long-lost, faithful servant. She felt her mind slip away, one memory at a time, her childhood, the faces of her parents, her first exciting day on the restoration team, gone, all of it erased, replaced with images of a desert throne of slaves bowing in the dust, the deafening roar of war drums, and the sight of blood being poured into 7 jars, one by one. The Sekhem-bearer had returned. Through her. At dawn, neighbors heard the sharp, sudden sound of shattering pottery. Nancy's door was ajar, swinging gently in a non-existent breeze. Inside, her apartment was filled with sand knee-deep and blowing in a swirling wind that had no source. Where Nancy had stood just hours before, there was only a hollow clay jar, cracked open from within. The 7th jar, empty again. But it was still warm, and it was still breathing. And somewhere in the city of Luxor, a figure walked through the sunrise, wrapped in linen, its face hidden behind a mask of ancient gold, moving with a newfound confidence, as though rediscovering a world that was once its own. Nancy's voice was gone, but her footsteps continued. At the edge of Luxor, a sandstorm rose suddenly. It was violent, swirling, unnatural. Travelers caught in its fury swore they saw a shape inside it, a tall silhouette, watching them from the heart of the storm. The desert had taken Nancy, piece by piece, and now the desert walked again, for the Sekhem-bearer had returned, and he would not stop until the other 6 jars scattered across the land found their way back to him, whether they were carried by fate or by new, unsuspecting victims. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more tales from the shadows.